Okay.
All right, well, thank you for being here, Dr. Geary. I
So,
appreciate it.
would you introduce yourself for us? Just, I'm Dan Geary, and
Yeah. So my name is Daniel Geary, and teach U.S. history at Trinity College in Dublin.
Gotcha. Okay. So, one of these softball questions. So, why or how did you become a historian? What is your route to where you are now in terms of your own background?
I think I was always interested in history. I grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, short distance from colonial Williamsburg, and I was actually a member of the Fife and Drum Corps. But I was disturbed at the very ahistorical way in which they sort of presented the colonial history, got got sort of an aversion to colonial history, which I eventually corrected in graduate school. But my main interest was really in modern period. So I think that had something to do with it, and I was always interested in politics, contemporary politics, and when I got to the University of Virginia, I found that history, to me at least, offered the sort of the best way to try to understand how we got to where we are today.
Okay, awesome. One question that's interesting is that some of our professors or some of the books or authors you read had some kind of high school or some kind of moment. Was there a book that you just liked before you became a scholar in the graduate studies? I mean, your undergrad or high school that you just really like, man, that's a great book, or kind of influenced you a little bit?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about, I mean, obviously there are individual professors that influenced me. Was there a single book that I read sort of early on as an undergraduate? I can't remember, but one thing I'll say is, because I've done intellectual history, that someone who influenced me was the philosopher Richard Rorty, who was teaching at Virginia when I was there, the pragmatist philosopher. He taught a class that, he called it from Nietzsche to Habermas, but we all called it from Rorty to Rorty, because it didn't matter who the thinker was, he made it come out sounding like himself. And even though he was a great professor, in some ways I was reacting to him because he was not doing intellectual history. He just wanted to use people to make his own points about today. And it seemed to me that was I suppose that's one way to do it if you're a philosopher, but as someone who was interested in history, I thought, well, let's figure out what people actually thought, what their ideas meant in the context of their time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Good question. And you kind of answered a little bit of your mentors. Or do you have any other mentors, like from, if we make the step to grad school, do you have any mentors, historians, once you became in the profession, so to speak?
I've been really lucky with mentors. Probably, the first one as an undergraduate was Nelson Lichtenstein, the labor historian who I did my senior thesis with, and he encouraged me to apply to graduate school. Also in Virginia, Alan McGill and Brian Ballow were important to me, but Nelson really was the main person I worked with there. He encouraged me to apply to graduate school, to go to his own place that he went to graduate school, Berkeley, and I went there and I studied with David Hollinger, who was a fantastic mentor to me as well. And I was lucky also to have many other wonderful people at Berkeley, like Walter Martin and Martin Jay, but also to pick up mentors sort of along the way, people who were interested in the same field as I am, with whom I had personal connections. So Howard Brick is someone who was really a great mentor to me, and that was true in graduate school. He's even though I didn't go to study with him, we had similar interests in common. He didn't have too many graduate students himself at that time, and then when I got my first job at the University of Nottingham in England, Richard King was an important mentor for me there. So I've been very fortunate in having many mentors along the way.
Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. A lot of grad students, even ourselves, just kind of curious about, did you have a topic of what you wanted to work on for dissertation, or your end goal before you came to Berkeley, or did you kind of finesse as you went through your courses?
No, I knew going into Berkeley, I mean, I suppose I could have changed my mind when I was there, but I was interested in C.R.I. Mills, subject to my first book, and actually he was part of my senior thesis at UVA. And so from that, I sort of knew I wanted wanted to work on Mills, and I knew there wasn't really a good biography, out there on him, so I knew it was something that hadn't really been done, and I came to Berkeley with that idea in mind, and then I followed that up, I suppose.
The rest is history, right?
Yeah.
All right. So we'll fast forward to your trajectory is a little interesting in terms of you teaching where you are, because you said you're at Trinity College,
Yeah.
correct? In Ireland, Dublin, Ireland?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nottingham, how do you make the leap from Berkeley? Not how, but like how did that happen in terms of the trajectory? Not many students of U.S. history know to even look beyond our borders for.
Yeah, I mean, some,
For,
I was using HNet, which everybody uses to look for jobs, and there were some international things. I think I applied for a job in Australia.
Wow.
My wife and I said, sure, let's go for it, and that didn't work out, but then I thought, well, England's a lot closer to Australia, so here's a job, and where I went, University of Nottingham is a very, it's an American Studies department, but they have an unusual tradition of studying American intellectual history. They've got students had to take a core course in intellectual history. Basically, they've had 3 or 4 faculty teaching that, so they really wanted someone who did, what I did.
Wow. Okay.
And so it was a really good fit in that sense. And then coming to Trinity was, in some sense, a personal decision. I mean, just my wife and I didn't especially like living in the area. We didn't have anything to do with the university, and
Yeah.
I have found Dublin, just much more congenial for us. But it's certainly the opportunities are there. You have a kind of a competitive advantage as an American who did U.S. history in the States. But there's a variety of sort of personal issues. It's a very difficult thing to move overseas. It can be very rewarding, but it is not the same thing as just moving across the country. I think we were a little naive. We thought, well, we were living in California, our family's on the East Coast. We thought, well, it's not going to be that much different, in terms of flights. But no, you're in a different country, you have a different legal status, and you're in a different culture, and you're now an outsider, and that's it's a real difference. Yeah.
Wow. So I guess you're giving some tips on expatriate issues that we don't think about.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So I guess and that's a good background. I mean, it kind of helps a lot of us kind of get a good foundation in terms of how you got where you are to write your
Yep.
books and your book and your upcoming projects. But how do you plan your research agenda as who you are as a historian, now that you are in the academy as a professional historian?
That's a good question, about a research agenda. I think that there's, I think people need time, to settle on the next project, to decide what they're going to do. I think it's a understandable but somewhat unfortunate aspect of the profession that people always ask you. You've written a book, and they say, well, what's the next book? And I think people need time to sort that out. Often, they've got a few book ideas going on at the same time. Maybe some article ideas, some articles turn into a book. I've found that serendipity has been one of the main things. I mean, you have things that you're interested in, but I didn't think I was writing a book on the Moynihan Report controversy until I got in the archives, and then I changed what I was doing. So I think you need to be open to new opportunities, and also to give yourself space to explore, to not be too rigid. And I never wanted to be one of those a scholar who kind of writes the same book over and over again and on the same topic. There are people who do this. And one of the people I admired when I was at Berkeley actually was a political scientist named Michael Rogan, who he started out as a conventional political scientist, but by the time I was there, he was basically writing about film, but in very interesting and original ways. It seems like that's what the tenure system should allow. It's people to have this kind of intellectual freedom to really explore new issues
And grow a little bit, I guess.
Yeah,
And you learn more. You don't know
Yeah.
what you did 10 years ago. You have a much more nuanced way of how you see the world, I guess, or you know more, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. So that actually answered the question of what is your process when you approach a new book, and I guess it's a lot more organic. It's not as, like I said, rigid. It's
That's
very,
right. Yeah.
and timing works out. I mean, you never know sometimes how things work out, but you got to be aware, I guess, or keep your eyes open or ears open. Seems like.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You got to be wary. It takes some time to explore, a book idea. So, I mean, I think that's you find when you talk to historians that this is often true. They say, well, I was writing an article on this, or I was writing, a chapter on this, and then that became the book.
Okay. And that kind of goes into the question of, so how's you interested in Moynihan Report? You kind of alluded to it in terms of you weren't purposely going to do a book on Moynihan. So how did that come up in terms of what you were trying to do first and how that became a book now?
Yeah, so I was writing a book I was interested in, because I've written about Sir Mills, as a sociologist, so I was interested in the influence of sort of sociological ideas on public policy in the 20th century U.S. And I was going to start out by looking at Du Bois and Jane Addams and sort of carry it up all the way to the present. And then I was going to do a chapter on, the Moynihan Report. And then when I got into archives, which had only been open a few years, I saw there was all this material that just hadn't been used, unpublished manuscript, a whole book that he wrote, trying to elaborate on the ideas of the report, letters from ordinary individuals and also from important people he consulted, and a lot, not just, what was striking is not just about Moynihan's ideas, but also like public reactions, because he really kept everything. And so I thought there's enough here for a book, and even though this is a story that's been told a lot, it hasn't been told with these resources, and it hasn't been, the full story hasn't really been told. This was the sense that I had. Now, when I was writing the book came out by James Patterson, Freedom is Not Enough, on the Moynihan Report. And now, when you're in the middle of a book, you don't want to hear, Bancroft Prize Award winner, has written a book on your subject. But luckily, when I read the book, I realized I had a very different take on it than he did. So, but there was a few months of anxiety there before I could get his book.
You gotta see what the competition's doing, right?
Yeah.
I'm just being funny about that, but well, you kind of answered it a little bit. I'd say you always kind of do great segues into other topics or questions, but one of them, to be more explicit, is how do you think, or why do you think historical treatments of the Moynihan Report have tended to focus on solely just interpreting its meaning and its original intent? Like, why is that such important lens for people to just harp on versus what you did?
It's a good question. I think it's because people are invested in the report, meaning they're invested in it, meaning one thing or another. So, in Patterson's case, he really wants to see this as a liberal document, a missed opportunity. So he, in a sense, can't really look at the full controversy because his only story is this is what Moynihan was said, he was right, and everybody who disagreed with it was just wrong. Now that's, I suppose, that's one interpretation of the report, but it's not one that can do justice to any of Moynihan's, critics, or the complexity of the story, at least in my view. There's another view that sort of was common, especially in the 90s, but is still out there. If you look at Alice O'Connor's book, Poverty Knowledge, where people wanted to look up, when they say, what are the roots of welfare reform in the 90s? And they say, oh, well, the Moynihan Report, this is sort of one of the origins to that. So again, the Moynihan Report is serving like a particular function, and it has to have like a single clear meaning. So when it took me a while to get to that point where I thought, well, what if we said the Moynihan Report kind of, yes, it has many meanings in it that people could take, but it also means what people thought it meant. Let's look at the meanings that people created in the document. This seems like a basic insight to me anyway, that if you look at reception theory or what have you, texts mean what the readers think they mean, in some sense, anyway.
Yeah. That actually goes into, okay, you're really good to segue in just into other good stuff, because the next question is, and this has more to do with your background in terms of how you were trained, how you see the world, how you analyze, versus the other historians and other disciplines that could have done the same thing, political science, sociology. But as a historian, though, what about your personal background, in terms of your professional background, allows you to add a different perspective, though?
I think that, let me...
Or your field, at least.
Let me point to two things. One is my training as an intellectual historian, which really, even though the Moynihan Report is, it's a political document, it has an important place in American political history. I think intellectual historians are used to looking at texts not necessarily as having single meanings, as having competing meanings, as being ambiguous. They're used to looking at text in their context. What's the background? What are the other ideas that are out there? How is it similar or different to other discourse that's going on? And in sort of the reception and use of those texts. So, and I think intellectual historians, at least in the tradition I was trained, are are very, empirical in their approach to, what kind of evidence can we actually find? What can we find in the archives that tells us this person was influencing that person, or this person reacted in this way or that way. So I think that's important. And the other thing I would point to is, living overseas, not being, I suppose, a direct influence on me, but in the sense of giving me some distance. I mean, the Moynihan Report is obviously, it's a very controversial text. I'm a white man, writing about a document that has an important place in African American history. And I think maybe if I had been in the U.S., I might have been dissuaded, thinking, oh, well, that's a controversial topic, or what stand, can I take on this document? Or people might have been asking me, what's your take on the Moynihan Report? Where you're gonna wind up, as if, where is it gonna position you, sort of politically, I suppose. But in Ireland, none of those issues sort of apply, and I think I had the distance to really look at it, with that sense of historical distance, to say, well, this is a sort of a past moment in history. Let's understand what was going on in all of the actors' minds, and let's tell the full story here.
And that's a good, let's say tangent, but just also from a point of view of, from your research, since you've been in Ireland and since you've done your book, do you have a perception of what the European or Irish lens is of the Moynihan Report? Is it even known, or is it considered something? I mean, those are in history, but overall, just the average debate or talk that you have with people in Ireland, do they even see the Moynihan Report from the same importance that we do in the U.S. for certain political issues?
I don't think it's especially well known. There are people who do know about it, especially academics, I suppose, or people interested in the history of American race. I mean, Moynihan was Irish American.
So I was curious about that.
And some of the ideas that he had about family, about welfare, there are parallels to what Irish people were thinking at the time. So it's not something I do in the book, but it'd be interesting to do. I didn't find in the book, if I found it, I certainly would have pursued it. International reactions to the Moynihan Report. I suspect there weren't, too many of interest. But if you wanted to look more at in a sort of comparative sense about other things that were being written in terms of social welfare and family, I know a scholar in New Zealand who wrote to me in the book. There's a very similar report that comes out of New Zealand about the Maori in the 1960s. So maybe this is something I'll pursue in the future, but it'd be interesting to view it in comparative international terms, I think.
Well, that's actually interesting. The international perspective of comparative. What do you think accounts for the Moynihan Report's enduring influence on American debates about race, poverty, etc.?
That's a great question. Obviously, there's a lot in the book about it. I mean, I think that two things that I stress in the book. I suppose one, the time that it comes about. In 1965. I mean, this is a moment where people really are debating what racial equality is going to look like beyond just the granting of civil rights. And the report still is a sort of marker for that moment that people go back to, either to say, oh, this was a kind of lost opportunity in one way or the other. Either people listened to Moynihan, things would be good, or there was a chance to do something and Moynihan kind of ruined it. So I think that's part of it. And the other part is, just that the document, it touched on so many different issues. Obviously, first and foremost on the issue of African American families, but related to that, the question of racial equality, the question of gender equality, and what should be a family structure, the question of poverty. So there's many different routes into the Moynihan Report, and many different interpretations that people can make of it as well. So it's proved a very, very useful document for lots of different people across the ideological spectrum.
Okay, very good. So if we were to fast forward and be more explicit about today, if we were to transpose the meanings back then and also the controversy and the aftermath immediately, what does it, or why does the Moynihan Report remain a key touchstone even up to today, 2015? That's a good question. I mean, I think especially for there's a lot of conservatives who love the Moynihan Report. I mean, they've got a certain narrative of it that's
leaves out a lot, you know. But for them, it provides this kind of easy narrative, which is, you know, because they need to provide an explanation, even though they support colorblind, you know, they support colorblind policies, but you know, they're not blind. Everyone looks around, and it's obvious that by any measure you want to use, you know, we don't have racial equality in the United States. So what's the explanation? And for conservatives, this is a very, you know, simple explanation. They can say, aha, you know, it's about family structure, and therefore, you know, there's nothing that, there's no national responsibility for this problem. It's kind of up to African Americans themselves to form stable families, and, you know, then they can progress that way. So it provides it, and not only that, the answer, but then they can say, oh, well, look at how crazy and irrational, you know, these liberals are. The sort of the civil rights movement was, you know, here was this guy Moynihan, he was well-intentioned, he had this good idea, and they rejected it, you know. So it's a very, and therefore makes conservatives seem like they're the ones who advocate racial equality because they have identified this family issue, whereas it's sort of liberals and the left who don't support equality because they won't listen to Moynihan. So it's very, very useful for them. As for you know, liberals, because the, you know, and even radicals, you know, who point to it, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's, you know, uses it in the Atlantic cover story. I think that's a more interesting case, but in some sense, I think they're looking for that kind of lost opportunity where they say maybe there was this moment where something could have been done. You know, people had listened to Moynihan not just about family, but in terms of a case for national action, for jobs programs, for family allowances, for other kinds of programs that would redistribute resources. You know, maybe, you know, and if maybe there was a chance before, then maybe there could be, you know, another chance again.
Gotcha. And so, talking about, to bring it back to Moynihan as the author of this report, although it would say he wasn't named on the report itself, but it's attributed to him.
Sure.
What can you say about the definitions or the evolution of white liberalism that he comes out of, that he's defined for himself, and how that's changed? I mean, does his background really fundamentally influence how he sees and what that liberal background means in terms of how the report is interpreted for liberals and conservatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the term white liberal is of this era, you know, of the Moynihan report era, really. You know, whereas previously people I suppose would use the term, you know, liberal, but that term white liberal already suggests that there's something, you know, it's a term of critique, you know, suggesting that the white liberals are not really willing to go far enough in terms of racial equality. Actually, talking about Moynihan, Julius Lester, the sort of Black Power intellectual, said that Moynihan was, quote, more white than liberal. That was his quote. So, you know, but in terms of, I don't think, actually, I mean, I think there's, we can understand as a polemical term, it's certainly the fact that Moynihan was white and came from a certain racial privilege, you know, is significant to his liberalism, but the sort of construction of what historians might call racial liberalism, from sort of the Myrdal report in 1944, American Dilemma, all the way up to the Moynihan report. I mean, that there are African Americans who are prominently involved in the construction of that, of those ideas. And if you take someone like Kenneth Clark, who's a supporter of the Moynihan report, at least initially, later he's a scathing critic of him when he's in the Nixon administration, but initially supports the Moynihan report and sees his ideas as very much in line with Moynihan. And I think it's very problematic to sort of say, as actually some of Clark's critics did, you know, you're actually representing a white point of view.
And that's actually a good segue, because I think part of your book, because you approached it the way you did, it does show that it's not, although it has connotations today about African American or even ethnographic lenses about family across the spectrum of present day American issues, it does go back to a time when race didn't always define who would support or would not support the ideas that Moynihan alluded to in his report. So how would you expound on?
Well, I don't think race determines it today either. I mean, I think he's got African American supporters and critics. So obviously, you know, it's true that if the race of a given intellectual is significant, but that doesn't, it hardly determines their views.
Gotcha. What were some of the biggest challenges with this topic in terms of research, writing, etc., in terms of what you had to deal with to even get this out, so to speak?
I think probably the biggest challenge for me, especially given versus past projects, was simply that the anniversary of the Moynihan Report is this year. It's the 50th anniversary. So you don't want to publish a book on the Moynihan Report like in 2016 or 2017, because then you kind of miss the boat. I had never worked on it's like a genuine, deadline before. You always had deadlines, but they can sort of be pushed back if you need extra time for the project. So I think that was the hardest thing for me was to complete the project on time, to be here, for the 50th anniversary, because it was important to me that it be part of the debate that would be had about the report. So.
Gotcha. All right. Well, last question, and thanks for your time at least. But what drew you to integration as a topic for your next upcoming stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, coming out of the project on the concept of integration and what did it mean, looking at the civil rights era, sort of the 40s to the 60s, but also before and after then our own current day of post-racial discourse. It came out of some things I discovered during the Moynihan Report book, but that I couldn't sort of fit in there, where the thing that was striking to me was you look at really, if you look at a narrow group of white liberals in 1964, 1965, they've all got different ideas about what integration means. And obviously, if you expand that lens, beyond that very narrow group, you've got more and more concepts. And I think it's a concept that it was obviously very important at the time in the discussion, and that historians have pretty much ignored, because historians say, or they say rightly, just to characterize like a whole group of the civil rights movement, say, well, these people were integrationists. It's a very misleading term as a historical category, but nevertheless, the fact that the concept existed, at the time, requires analysis. So I think that's sort of what I'm going to be looking into anyway.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to South Carolina, and just thank you for being a writer of such a great, important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.